it's got means areas identified on the planning maps which are at risk of flooding in a major event, no problem. And where raised floor levels apply. Why is that a necessary part of the definition? Because some council in the future may in fact decide that finished floor levels aren't the only answer to the question around exposure to flood risk. It doesn't seem to me that it's a definition of flood management area. It's a definition of what happens after you are in a flood management area.
Yep.
Yeah, I agree with you. We'll do some further work on that and bring that back.
Thank you. There were a lot of definitions in here, like garden and patio supplier and various other things, which I thought, how come? Why do we have to have definitions of these things? Why?
It's a bit like everything to do with planning. It's about finding the balance. We have lawyers who argue the toss. No disrespect to lawyers.
No, it's all right. I used to be one.
On particular names and words that we use, so that's why they're in there.
Yeah, but why? I mean, what is it in the wider plan that needs us to define what a guardian and patio supplier is? For goodness sake, why? Who cares?
Do you want to have a go?
That particular definition is actually one of the secondary definitions that's been brought through, because it's referred to as one of a number of activities within the primary definition of trade supplier, which is a definition that's been required by the industrial chapter. So again, it's just endeavouring to provide some clarity and some certainty around the extent of that initial primary definition.
So a garden and patio supplier wouldn't be regarded as a trade supplier without this separate definition. Is that what you're saying?
It's currently considered consistent with a trade supplier by the current plan.
Mark,
In our industrial zone, just by way of context, in the existing plan and proposed plan, trade suppliers are provided for in our general industrial zone. It's currently called a business 4 zone, which trade suppliers range from building improvement centres such as Bunnings through to landscape suppliers, and the current definition of trade suppliers lists a range of industries that fall within that wider scope of what a trade supplier is, and that includes garden and patio suppliers. And with reference to those different elements of what a trade supplier is, the plan at the moment subsequently defines what each of those elements means. And so...
Yes, I can now see that. Except for a catering supplier. A catering equipment supplier isn't defined. Farming and agriculture. Oh, yeah, farming and agriculture is.
there are a couple of things in here that aren't defined. Most of them are.
So it's I mean, it just struck me that, because I look at a definition section as trying to limit. Well, hire suppliers, okay, they're safe, they don't need a definition. Industrial clothing and safety equipment suppliers. Oh my God, that could mean so many things.
Okay.
Oh, fortunately, it doesn't need a definition either.
So,
I mean, I'm being slightly sarcastic here, but not being detrimental to the people in the planning industry as opposed to the legal industry. But, you know, we need to have a plan that defines all of these things. Don't we know what an automotive and marine supplier is, building supplier?
Look, I totally accept your concern about this. What we could do is have in there the ANZIC list of what are considered trade suppliers.
Yeah.
The difficulty comes in where you might have, landscape suppliers listed as a trade supplier, And then you get a garden or patio supplier who actually doesn't meet the definition under ANZIC of what a landscape supplier is. So, you know, that's the kind of thing that we're having to deal with here. So we could potentially simplify it. It just means that when it comes to court, there might need to be, or if it goes to court, or if there's a consent, there might need to be more work on that at the time.
Madam Chair, perhaps I can further add to that. These provisions came out of a plan change, which was focused on the council's intent to facilitate retail activity happening in commercial areas, not in industrial areas.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of context in which we're looking at these definitions. The policy behind the need for definitions like this is to identify what activity the plan wants to see in commercial areas and what activity would need resource consent if it wants to set up in an industrial area. So you've got a context of saying, okay, we want to enable trade suppliers to set up in industrial areas because that doesn't have an adverse effect on the functioning of other commercial areas. But we don't want to open the floodgates to everyone putting up their hand and saying, hey, I'm a trade supplier. So that's the need for those sort of fairly circular definitions. Yes, we can try and simplify them, but the simplification is still with the intent of being very clear what's okay in an industrial area and what do we want to see in a commercial area.
Yeah.
And similar issues are raised through the plan change for the special purpose airport zone about trade suppliers. The same sort of arguments are arising there.
Yeah, yep. Vicky?
The definition of community, and sorry, my apologies for lateness, so you may have covered this off. Community housing unit and social housing. Given that we may look at an approach in Christchurch for affordable housing, which doesn't quite meet these definitions, how will we ensure that the definition is wide enough to include that? So social housing will be almost defined by the tenant after the middle of April this year, under the government's reforms. So social housing as defined will not cover the whole of affordable housing.
I'm still waiting on some suggested rewording from the solicitors around that, and it may be that they may have identified and will cover that issue, or potentially either needs to be considered to be included within whatever definitions come out of that, or potentially a separate definition on its own.
In terms of community housing unit and social housing, that we put affordable housing in there as well.
That would be something we'd have to consider.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, otherwise we're going to be in the position where...
Will it come up in the residential chapter, will it?
Yeah.
Yes, it will do, but they're not always exactly the same, and you'll probably know that the government even doesn't have a consistent affordable housing definition, so we just need to be careful what the implications are there.
I see they've got one in their LURP.
Yes, there is one in the LURP.
But they're saying they're about to revise it. But I just want to flag that definition will be problematic for us as a council. So I'm not sure. So we do need to address it in terms of affordable housing. Social housing and affordable housing will blur, and it will be the tenant that defines whether it's a social house or an affordable house.
Yeah, I think Housing New Zealand have identified this in their submission on this. So on page 25 of the document you've just circulated, it's got the definition is considered very limited in scope. The definition law only captures development of units by HNZC and CCC and does not extend to other housing providers, does not recognise contemporary approaches to funding and delivering social housing developments. For example, operating in partnership with a private developer to develop a mix of social and private housing, which might pick up the affordable housing side of it. So, but you say you're working with the lawyers, you're working with Housing New Zealand to come up with some...
Well, put it this way, the definition that you have in front of you was amended in response to what you've just read out, but obviously it still needs further work, and as I said...
Yeah, I think that what's missing is the is that private component that may be part of the final development, and then you don't have to deal with the issue around affordable housing. Glenn?
Thank you. Just on that definition, just to clarify too, is that definition inferring that the council actually is a registered community housing provider? Because this is another moot point in this whole conversation at the moment too.
No.
Or is that
No,
positioning
it
that
makes
as an
that an
or?
option.
As an
It
option.
makes that an option, but it also recognises that there are others in that space other than the council and Housing New Zealand. So it says council, Housing New Zealand, or a registered housing provider.
Right.
The key issue with it will be that we want to pepper pot those around mixed developments,
Yeah.
and some of these definitions will limit that.
Yeah. Andrew?
Two questions, if I can. The first one, neighbourhood centres on page 36. We've got Akaroa and Littleton in the list, but we define a neighbourhood centre as the commercial core zone and the commercial fringe zone. It looks as though we should have Commercial Banks Peninsula zone in that list as well, just as a point of detail.
That's correct. We'll amend that.
Great, thank you. And then I just wanted to also ask a question about noise-sensitive activities. The first thing I noticed is that this was quite difficult to find because it's not in correct alphabetical order. And then the second point, so noise-sensitive activities, point C, guest accommodation refers specifically to airport noise. Is guest accommodation not covered by the port noise overlay?
At present, no, it's not. If I can just give you a bit of background to this definition is effectively trying to combine three separate but noise-sensitive related definitions that currently exist. There was one required in relation to the commercial and industrial zone by Mark. There was the one in LERP around the airport noise contours. And the third one was the existing Banks Peninsula definition in relation to the port. So I've tried to combine them but retain the pertinent bits to each. And the clause E, which is the bit specific to the port, it includes everything that's currently in the definition. What's not currently in the definition is guest accommodation, although it was one of the extra activities that has been asked for through public feedback, and I have included that now, but I excluded hotels, which was also asked for, because that type of activity of its own nature has noise generating activities itself. Does that answer your question?
Okay, so is the intention then that guest accommodation wouldn't be covered by the port noise overlay, is that right?
It would.
It would be?
Yeah.
Despite there's nothing, so there's a change which isn't incorporated into what we've got in front of us?
That's right.
Okay, thank you.
So did you pick up habitat then? Was that yours? Well, habitat's just a terrible mistake unless you think that people make up little fairy beings. It's just you've put habitable spaces and habitat together into one definition of habitat. It should start on the third line. Means the area or environment where an organism or ecological community lives, not the residential unit or short-term accommodation establishment. It's just a mistake.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how that happened, but that certainly didn't start out that way.
No. I started reading it and I thought, how are they describing that as a habitat?
Yeah, there's been a few instances where it appears there's some sort of electronic corruption of stuff as it gets...
Well, I think what happens is that quite often if you put a beginning of a word in, then it just picks up what's gone before if it's in a program. So
This is the type of thing we'll be picking up in that final edit.
Just going back to the noise-sensitive activities, one of the biggest problems we had with events in the central city is the balance between the new townhouses and penthouses and the strip, and the noise levels that we were trying to keep to kind of killed any activity that you really wanted to do in the central city. So how are we going to balance that? Because my suggestion when I was asked or invited onto a council board or a group working party which I left was that you either have to soundproof the venues they're in or soundproof the buildings you're building or some apartments, which would be the preferred because of outdoor activity. And yet we were told that that wasn't going to happen because of added cost, which would then prevent the development. So it was like chicken or the egg or the carrot, whatever. The fact of the matter, it wasn't working. So how are we going to make it work?
With your leave, if we could discuss that in more detail in the residential chapter. This is just the definition of what those words mean,
Yep.
but that matter is dealt with in the residential chapter.
Okay. Yeah.
Degree of size needed for I'm aware that in the legal highs legislation, there's a sensitivity around educational facilities and health facilities. And if people were creative, they may seek to establish those such that there was no place for legal highs. So when we define, so you have to be more than 100 metres from such a place. If we were, for example, to limit them to the central city, some real potential exists for people to establish an educational or health facility such that no stores could be there, which is interesting and creative and will no doubt arise. So when you define an educational activity, how big does it need to be?
It's not based on size.
No,
Right, and
it's just the activity.
so in theory, an educational activity which I see needs a systematic curriculum, which is a nice 19th century view of education, and one that I'd really like taken out. Systematic curriculum, but if you were creating a daycare centre for 5 children, that would qualify as an education facility.
Under this definition, I believe so.
Right, and a health facility such that one person was counselling from that facility, would that be, or 5 people were counselling? How big does it need to be in this definition that's here on page 25?
Yeah, again, neither of the education activity or the healthcare facility definitions have a minimum or a maximum size
Okay.
at present.
Any size restrictions you'll find come in the zone itself. So size restrictions are specific rules, and the way you do definitions is you try and take out those standards or rules out of definitions and put them in the chapter that they apply. So different residential zones might have different sizes of education facilities. So that's where you'd look to find those sorts of restrictions.
Okay.
Yep.
What is the status of recovery plans under the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Act as of the 16th of April 2016? Because all of the orders in council expire as of that date, so, and the legislation does as well. Does the recovery strategy and recovery plans passed under that legislation have any legal standing beyond that date?
Madam Chair, the changes that the recovery plans have made to the other statutory instruments, such as the currently operative district plan or the regional policy statement, those changes that have been made through the recovery plan would remain in effect.
Only because they've been made to the document itself.
Yes, exactly.
So referencing these documents at the back of the definition section might need to refer to the fact that they themselves expire, if that is the legal position. If they legally expire as of those dates, I think we have to reference that in the appendices, yeah.
I don't believe they do, but we will check that and get back to you because it is a good detail that you should be aware of.
Well, we do need to know.
I don't believe that they do.
And I also think
go in here.
and that means that at that point we could trigger another series of amendments to our district plan
Yes, but because as of April 2016, there will no longer be the provision in the CER Act that says only the minister can change the provisions that have been put in there by the recovery
Right.
plan.
So for example, if there were issues that were outstanding in the CBD as of that time, we could in fact signal a review of our district plan to deal with the CBD issues.
Yes.
Yeah. Very good. Right, are there any other questions or comments on the draft definitions and glossary? That's been very helpful. Oh, Jimmy Chen.
General questions. Because you mentioned this one, some of them already have a definition through the government, maybe documents, etc. Some of them didn't. If it didn't, I'm wondering if we have this the definition. But how about our neighboring district council, for instance, like Solvent or the Waimea, whether they recognize this one or not? Otherwise, might be confused. If the same wording, you know, but a different definition, different meaning. This is my particular concern.
The other chapter leaders who were responsible for identifying what they needed in the way of definitions were also asked to liaise with the staff of the adjoining territorial authorities to ensure some consistency.
Also, the UDS organisations had staff on CAG, the Collaborative Advisory Group. So where there has been the opportunity to be consistent, that has been worked through, but for various reasons there may not always be consistency between the use of words and how they're applied.
And it may also be that because context is very important to the definitions, that it may be that while Selwyn or Waimak have a definition for a certain word or phrase, we don't necessarily need that and we don't have one.